Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our 16th Tokyo International University Global Dialogue session, and the first session of an exciting series of events that we'll be hosting this semester here at Tokyo International University. Today's session is a hybrid session, meaning that we have both a virtual audience joining us online and an in-person audience with us here today in Kawagoe. And for those attending virtually, please use the Q&A tab in the webinar to ask your questions, which will be answered in the Q&A session after the talk. Now today, we have the pleasure of welcoming our first speaker of the semester, a renowned scholar of Japan's foreign and security policies, who will be presenting on the topic of his latest book published by Stanford University Press, Overcoming Isolationism, Japan's Leadership in East Asian Security Multilateralism. Professor Midford has published widely on the topic of Japan's foreign and security policies and has a scholarly career that spans at least 3 continents, having held academic appointments in Japan, the United States, and Europe. In fact, before coming to Meiji Gakuin, where Professor Midford is now a professor in international studies, Professor Midford held the position of professor in the Department of Sociology and Political Science and director of the Japan program at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Professor Midford, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and joining us here in Kawagoe today. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lamont, for that very kind introduction. As he mentioned, I'm going to talk today about my latest monograph or book, Overcoming Isolationism, and look at the story of how Japan pivoted from being essentially an opponent of regional security multilateral cooperation to its leading champion. So go to the next slide. So I really kind of addressed 3 puzzles or questions. First of all is why during the Cold War did Japan pursue a strategy of what I call regional security isolationism, including this rejection of regional security multilateralism, which I'm calling RSM for short. And then why, on the cusp of the Cold War's end in July 1991, did Japan suddenly reverse its opposition and pivot towards supporting regional security multilateralism, and particularly proposing East Asia's first region-wide multilateral security forum? And then why, since 1991, has Japan continued to be arguably the leading champion of this kind of regional security cooperation in East Asia? Next slide, please. So for these 3 puzzles, I have a couple of answers. My kind of main answer is something known as reassurance. So I argue that Japan pursued security isolationism during the Cold War as a way to reassure its neighbors it would not reemerge as a military threat. However, around the end of the Cold War, by the time of 1991, this strategy was reaching its limits because Japan had become too big an actor to be sort of to continue to maintain security isolationism. So Japan started to play a larger security role regionally and globally, and started to promote regional security multilateralism as a way to reassure its neighboring countries that it would not reemerge as a security threat. Now, there's some secondary reasons as well. Japan tried to moderate what we call its alliance security dilemma with the United States, this kind of fear of entrapment by the United States and conflicts not in its interest versus kind of abandonment by the US, which is a problem that any state in alliance faces. Also, Japan has used security multilateralism to develop new kind of security utilities, as I call them, things that are not really provided by the US-Japan alliance, and Japan cannot really provide very well on its own, such as regional counter-piracy cooperation, disaster relief, counterterrorism, and some other kind of so-called non-traditional security utilities, areas where there's a need for cooperation, but and multilateralism has proved the best way to pursue that. Next slide, please. So what do I mean by Japan's security isolationism? What I mean is that during the Cold War, Japan avoided security contacts, security cooperation with essentially all countries except for the United States. And Japan's security entirely centered on the US-Japan alliance. I even almost a little tongue-in-cheek would call this a type of security sock holder. So for example, Japan joined this multilateral naval exercise, Rim of the Pacific, known as RIMPAC in 1981. But for over a decade, until about 1994, for Japan, this was a bilateral exercise in close proximity to a multilateral exercise, meaning that Japan just exercised with the US Navy, while the US Navy and other countries exercised multilaterally. In fact, the US Navy broke into two groups during this exercise, one to just exercise with Japan, and the other group to exercise with everybody else. That's how strict Japan was in terms of maintaining its security isolation. And just as kind of a side note here, I would argue that this kind of security isolationism, which by the way has not entirely disappeared, we can still sometimes see strains of it, even in the Abe administration. Plus what I call kind of Japan, the defensive realist attitudes we see in Japan among the Japanese public, namely that, you know, military power, the SDF has utility for defending Japanese territory, but not really anything else. And the kind of so-called culture of anti-militarism we saw in post-war Japan, some skepticism of the military and or the state's ability to use the military. This is what equals what I call Japan's kind of so-called post-war pacifism. That's just kind of a side note. We can talk more about that later if you are interested. Next slide, please. So, and as I alluded to earlier, Japan also was opposed to regional security multilateralism. Its security isolationism prevented it from meaningfully participating. Japan also opposed so-called confidence building measures, CBMs, in part because it feared self-identifying as a military threat. Also, Japan opposed this cooperation for some other reasons. The Soviet Union, starting with a collective security proposal for Asia by Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, was the primary proponent of regional security multilateralism in the 60s and 70s. And also there was this fear that Soviet proposals would lead to so-called asymmetrical naval and arms control, or also asymmetrical arms control or reduction in terms of air power, two areas where the US was entirely dominant and Japan was the second leading power. So the situation was different in Europe, where there was kind of a trade-off between Soviet ground power, its land army versus American air and naval power, but that wasn't so much of a factor in this region. Also, Japan was concerned about the implications of regional security multilateralism for its territorial dispute with the Soviet Union over the Northern Territories. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, 1991 is kind of the pivot in terms of Japan's policy. So Sato Yukio, a former, now retired top Japanese diplomat, who I interviewed extensively for this book, and who was really the architect of this pivot. A month before the pivot happened, he gave a speech to a closed-door meeting of security elites in Manila, and I won't read the full quote, but basically his point here is that for the sake of reassurance, Japan was keeping a low political profile in East Asia. In fact, he doesn't even talk about Japan playing a security role, but his point was to avoid arousing skepticism or concern for other East Asian countries, Japan was basically keeping a low profile. This also relates to something over a decade earlier, the Fukuda Doctrine, named after former Prime Minister Fukuda Takeo in 1977, in which he promised Japan would not become a military power capable of invading and threatening other countries. And in exchange for this and essentially an institutionalization of security isolationism, he asked for the region to accept Japan's dominant economic role in the region. And at that point, Japan was very dominant economically. And also to allow Japan to begin to play some kind of political role, although between 1991 and 1977, that didn't develop very much. Now, the Fukuda Doctrine implied that Japan wouldn't even talk about security with its neighbors. And Fukuda himself, and this is one chapter in the book, came to this belief that Japan needed to reassure its neighbors from a couple of things. including his pre-war experiences and including his stint as finance minister in the 1960s when he negotiated over the establishment of the Asian Development Bank, ADB, and he attempted to have the headquarters put in Tokyo, but the rest of the region wanted it put elsewhere. It ended up in Manila. And in his own writings, he talks about, lingering mistrust of Japan, that he was one lesson he learned from this. And as foreign minister in the early 1970s, he established the Japan Foundation, in part also for reassurance to build kind of understanding and trust in Japan. Next slide, please. So more broadly, the end of the Cold War caused a looming security vacuum in East Asia as the Soviet Union drew down its military presence in the region. At the same time, the US also started reducing its military presence in the region. And this occurred in the context of sharpening US-Japan conflict over economic issues, over trade issues, and also over the Gulf War and Japan's contribution, or some would say suboptimal contribution to the US war effort there. Japan was beginning to loom as a potential military power and potential threat to the countries of the region, because Japan's economy was, first of all, extremely dominant. It was larger than the rest of East Asia and even South Asia combined. In fact, it was approaching, I think, almost twice as large by this point. So that was one issue. Japan had found itself with a greater need to reassure East Asian countries, since it was potentially looming as a much more dominant actor in the region. At the same time, Japan wanted to begin playing a more active role in regional and global security. There was a kind of frustration in the foreign ministry. Some of this had to do with the belief that the US, particularly under Secretary of State James Baker, was kind of ignoring Japan. And Japan had emerged as the world's largest provider of economic assistance or official development assistance, ODA. So there was also a desire to play a larger role. And also the sense that as the second largest economy, Japan had become essentially too large to kind of be contained within the US-Japan alliance and the security isolationism, and had to begin playing a larger role. This was one of the lessons of the Gulf War. So Japan responded by beginning to play a larger role. It decided to join UN peacekeeping operations, sending the SDF overseas for the first time. And it also proposed a like-minded regional security dialogue of the US. And actually, I wrote here US allies, but really more accurately, US, its allies, and US friendly countries, including some non-aligned or neutral countries like Indonesia, through the ASEAN PMC, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations post-ministerial conference. This was a conference that actually grew out of the Fukuda Doctrine in 1977, where you started having an annual meeting. After the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting, they would meet their Japanese counterpart. That started in the late 70s, and very quickly that grew into a meeting of ASEAN and its so-called dialogue partners, including Japan, the US, initially France and Britain, later the EU, and South Korea, Australia, Canada. So the Nakayama proposal of July 1991, named after Foreign Minister Nakayama Taro, was just this proposal, this idea of establishing this security dialogue within the ASEAN PMC. That's the pivot. And that was largely written, devised by this diplomat I mentioned, Sato Yukio, with some participation from others. Now, ASEAN, particularly, it's funny today, you look at ASEAN ISIS and you're wondering what that means, but it's the Institute for Strategic and International Studies, a network of think tanks, made its own proposal around the same time, and even talked to Sato about establishing a regional security dialogue. And however, what actually emerged, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, actually more closely resembles what ASEAN ISIS had proposed. Nonetheless, Japan played a big role in helping to shape the ARF, and particularly played a big role in helping to overcome US opposition. Japan persisted in promoting the idea even when some ASEAN countries, especially Indonesia, and the US were initially skeptical. James Baker, when he heard the proposal, responded by saying, essentially, if more or less quoting him, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." What he meant was, we have this wonderful security architecture in East Asia, the so-called hub and spokes, with all these bilateral alliances radiating out from the US to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And he saw the Nakayama proposal as essentially a potential replacement, when in fact it was intended to be a supplement, not at all a replacement. That said, Japan was also kind of ambivalent in terms of the way the ARF emerged, because one big difference between ASEAN and the Nakayama proposal is that ASEAN wanted to include everybody. It wanted to include the Soviet Union, then Russia. It wanted to include Communist China, Vietnam, whereas the Nakayama proposal had just been states that were more friendly to the US, quote unquote. This was a big problem for Indonesia, which was much more neutral or non-aligned. And in fact, they were insisted if there was going to be a security forum, it had to include all the powers. And that's eventually what happened. Now, within Japan, there was some controversy about this. The foreign ministry and the Sorenka or Russia-ka, the Soviet Russian desk, was very much opposed to including the Soviet Union. That was the real sticking point for Japan. But some in Japan, like Prime Minister Miyazawa or Sato Yukiya, were more comfortable including Russia. And that is eventually what happened. Eventually, Japan's reluctance was overcome. Now, the ARF was kind of established sort of initially as a two-track organization, because you have the ARF, which is an unlike-minded forum that involves countries like China and Russia. And the PMC still existed as a like-minded forum where only the US and US so-called friendly countries were included. However, in 1995, ASEAN decided unilaterally to admit Russia, China, and India to the PMC. And it's interesting, when I looked at foreign ministry documents that I got under Freedom of Information Act while writing this book, in 1991, Japanese diplomats were very confident that they could prevent that from happening because they had a voice in the PMC and they could object. But when it came down to it, ASEAN just acted on its own and Japan really couldn't do anything about it. In some sense, this also kind of challenged the kind of special relationship that Japan built with ASEAN since the Fukuda Doctrine. So Japan, after this, tried to rebuild that kind of special relationship through something called the Hashimoto Doctrine. Next slide, please. Which I'll get to in a moment. But there's also kind of a debate about whether Japan kind of lost interest by the mid to late 1990s in regional security multilateralism. Some like Yuzawa Takeshi at Hoseidai University have claimed that Japan's initial exuberance towards RSM had dissipated by the late 1990s. But in my view, MOFA had never been that exuberant to begin with. There had been some exuberance in the press and by some politicians, but they'd always had a very long-term perspective and saw it developing gradually rather than making a big difference anytime soon. And also, just again, Japan had never really promoted a unlike-minded forum like the ARF to begin with. Now, the Hashimoto Doctrine was an attempt to recover this kind of close relationship and a like-minded forum by proposing an annual ASEAN-Japan summit. And ASEAN's answer was very creative. ASEAN said, okay, we'll have an annual summit with Japan. And by the way, we're going to invite China and Korea too. So that led to the establishment of the ASEAN +3, not necessarily a like-minded organization, but another important step in terms of developing at least political and eventually even security on a limited basis, multilateralism in East Asia. Next slide, please. So at the turn of the century, Japan used the ARF for various purposes. And just to illustrate kind of the use of the ARF in security multilateralism here, Japan used it to build consensus in favor of multilateral cooperation for combating piracy, establishing the idea, building a consensus, establishing kind of the norm. And this laid the groundwork then for Japan's leadership to negotiate the so-called Regional Cooperation Agreement in Combating Piracy and Armed Robbery Against Ships in Asia. That's quite a mouthful. And the acronym is RECAP. And after that, Japan played a leading role in establishing the RECAP Information Center, ISC, in Singapore, that monitors maritime traffic in Southeast Asia to, as a way to combat piracy and to promote maritime safety. Japan is the second largest contributor to that after Singapore, which is where the headquarters is located. And the director of the ISC has always been a Japanese up to now. So that's one leading example. Next slide, please. Japan has also established various other political and security multilateralisms since the turn of the century, including the East Asian Summit in 2005, despite American opposition. Japan made and supported proposals that expanded the involvement of defense ministries in the ARF. The ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is more of a foreign ministry-centric organization, but Japan tried to expand that, also bringing in military officers to enrich the kind of security discussion and cooperation there. And also promoted the establishment of eventually of the ASEAN Defense Ministers, that's Defense Ministers meeting plus 8 dialogue partners in 2010, known as the ADMM+, which is a deepening of kind of security multilateralism that is defense ministry centric rather than foreign ministry centric, more on the kind of hard security side. And then the Noda administration in 2011 and 2012 used the ARF to build support for its proposal for an expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum. So there was an ASEAN Maritime Forum to talk about maritime issues in Southeast Asia, the South China Sea. And he managed to convince ASEAN to support the creation of an expanded forum that would bring in Japan, the US, and other dialogue partners. And this is particularly important because ASEAN and China have been negotiating over a code of conduct in the South China Sea. And this was a way for Japan and the US to get a voice at the table and try to influence that. And Japan also played a leading role in promoting Northeast Asian multilateral or trilateral cooperation, what I call the Northeast Asian Three, what's more nondescriptly called the trilateral mechanism. And Japan also was the country that proposed adding security cooperation to the ASEAN +3 and also to the Northeast Asian 3 cooperation. And actually some of the non-traditional security cooperation there has been quite substantial, such as cooperation on nuclear plant security, etc. Next slide, please. So Japan, just to kind of summarize my argument here, Japan has used RSM to create a legitimate voice for itself in regional security issues, something it did not really have in 1991. Japan really didn't have a place to talk about regional security issues. Japan has used the ARF and other RSM institutions to then successfully reassure various countries, paving the way for bilateral security partnerships that have emerged over the past decade, particularly the Japan-Philippines security partnership, another one with Vietnam, and another one with Indonesia. The ones with the Philippines and Vietnam are particularly significant. They've involved the transfer of Coast Guard vessels and used SDF training aircraft to the Philippines. Next slide, please. Now, Japan has used RSM also to create these new security utilities I just mentioned, such as the counter-piracy functions of RECAP, and expand its cooperation and role in Southeast Asia without provoking kind of threat perceptions. I should mention in 1999, after a Japanese vessel had been hijacked by pirates, Japan proposed Southeast Asian patrols for the Japanese Coast Guard in cooperation with regional countries. That was rejected. That was seen as kind of, if not threatening, too much of a role, unilateral role by Japan. And it's in reaction to that that Japan pushes for RECAP. Also, these organizations have been useful for military exchanges and for HADR, which is Humanitarian and Disaster Relief Joint Training. In fact, it's often not, it's a somewhat little known fact that the ARF actually holds its own military exercises. Although they are disaster relief exercises, they're also military medicine type of exercises. And the ADM also does that. ADMM Plus does that as well. Now, RSM also provides a platform for balancing against China and countering Chinese efforts to isolate Japan. So it can also be used for political competition, building coalitions to, in some cases, oppose policies that China is pursuing Japan doesn't like. In other words, preventing, trying to head off China from building a counter coalition, such as when it tried to, had some success in getting ASEAN countries to criticize US-Japan missile defense plans in the 1990s. It also has some value for the more traditional role of reducing the threat of conflict, mostly through strengthening confidence building measures, such as encouraging every state in the region to publish a defense white paper that provides some transparency on the military, which, by the way, that is a Japanese initiative that Japan proposed in the mid-1990s. Next slide, please. Okay. Also, RSM has been Japan's tool for ensuring continued US engagement and even expanding it. This is also a little understood role of RSM. Both the ARF and ADMM Plus are, as official Asian experts in Washington told me, one-stop shopping for US officials, meaning that they can, US secretaries of state and defense can go to these meetings and meet all of their regional counterparts there. And that tends to pull them into the region, pull them into more visits to East Asia than they would otherwise. Because you look at their travel schedules, they tend to go overwhelmingly to Europe and the Middle East. And even though East Asia is so important, they've tended to make less trips out to this region. This helps to combat that. It allows US defense and foreign policy elites to better understand the regional security environment. As one former official in Washington told me, you go to one of these meetings, the first thing you realize, ASEAN isn't NATO, which is not something they would necessarily pick up on just being in Washington. There are also other they get to know the local culture. One person was saying what they remember most about ASEAN is also all the shirts they have to wear, the batik and other things. So there's a bit of cultural climatization going on. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, Japan's 1991 pivot away from regional security isolationism turned Japan into the most consistent champion of regional security multilateralism. It allows Japan to play a security role without provoking threat perceptions from neighboring countries. It has reduced those threat perceptions over time, allowing Japan to build security partnerships with countries such as the Philippines. It helps also to ensure continued US engagement. And also, again, helps to provide these new security utilities that have been underprovided by the US-Japan alliance, such as counter-piracy, or which Japan cannot provide on its own. Other types of maritime security. Also, the ARF became key in terms of counter-terrorism efforts in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. The George W. Bush administration, not having a reputation for supporting multilateralism, really embraced the ARF after 9/11 as the only really viable regional organization for coordinating counter-terrorism efforts against Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. This is just a list. It's actually something from my book of all the different multilateral and political security structures in East Asia and Japan's role, some of which occurred during the Cold War and were relatively short-lived. The ones that really matter today are the PMC, which Japan helped to establish in 1978, and then the ASEAN-Japan Forum I didn't mention in this talk, that's also significant. The ASEAN Regional Forum, and then the APT, et cetera. And in all of these, Japan is, almost all of these, Japan is an initiator or co-initiator. The East Asian Summit Foreign Ministers meeting, well, Japan was a co-initiator of the original summit, not necessarily the foreign ministers meeting, but pretty much all of these. There are a few exceptions. You also have this Beijing Jiangshang Forum, which is actually an attempt by China to try to build a different kind of regional security multilateralism where it is more central. But one other thing that comes out from this and from my book is ASEAN centrality in terms of regional political and security cooperation. Almost everything has to go through ASEAN. And Japan, again, played a really big role in that. Japan was the first country to emphasize ASEAN centrality, to deal with ASEAN as a group, not just individually with each member. And that dates back to the Fukuda Doctrine. Next slide. So, and then finally, it's a mistake to suggest that Japan refocused on the US alliance from the 1990s and beyond due to disillusionment with the ARF. Not only because claims of disillusionment, I would argue, are exaggerated, but because Japan never saw the ARF as a substitute for the alliance in the first place. It was always had a different role to play in terms of reducing the potential of conflict, not as a some kind of military alliance. And although Japan's reputed initial exuberance about the ARF, particularly among the media and some politicians, receded after a few years, what was revealed underneath, I argue, is this kind of consistent long-term commitment to making incremental progress in promoting cooperative security through the ARF, the ADM plus, et cetera. One of the biggest problems with the ARF actually is that it's said to have too big a membership. It involves a lot of countries that aren't that useful for East Asian security, like say Pakistan or Bangladesh. But ironically, the Indo-Pacific concept that Prime Minister Abe promoted actually really enhances the ARF's importance because it definitely includes the Indo side of the Indo-Pacific as well. So in that sense, it's in some ways actually the importance of the ARF has grown over time. And this problem of it having too big a membership, in fact, it has the second largest membership after the United Nations of any organization, has actually come to be more of an asset in recent years, I would argue. Now, even when the ARF, and this is the final point, even when the ARF has appeared not to work in Japan's interest or maybe work more to China's advantage, this has not reduced Japan's interest in regional security multilateralism, but rather has changed, reduced expectations about making gains versus preventing losses. So some of the critiques you hear is that, well, if Japan isn't making gains to the ARF, it's losing interest in it. The ARF, regional security multilateralism, can be used to make gains. It can also be used to prevent losses. So you have to look at it from that perspective as well as what has it done for me lately. Okay, next slide. And with that, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. It certainly gives us a lot to think about in the context of current events and the future of Japan's security multilateralism in light of what has taken place so far this year in 2022. I'll now open the floor for questions from the virtual and in-person audience. Oh, yes, so please say your name. Please.
My name is Paul. QUAN, fourth year International Relations student, undergrad student at TIU. And one question, we start with Paul. Yeah. So you mentioned a lot about security multilateralism as a main factor for Japan to pursue first of regional countries, especially those in Southeast Asia. But I wonder, what is your view on the thing that comes before that security multilateralism, which is the economic cooperation, increasingly Japanese investment, which, to my knowledge, to the extent I know, gain a lot of trust of Southeast Asian elite. And I think that is one of the main factors that provide the confidence for those elite to open for security cooperation and overcome their past to cooperate with Japan in terms of security and defense. And also, that's one, because I think that in Southeast Asia at that time, it's not much about that democratic as the Western countries. So the elite void is really important. And I think that because the elite void important, the economic cooperation and investment of Japan to those countries has been one cornerstone or the bedrock for the future security multilateralism of Japan. So what is your view on that, Professor Midford?
Okay. Thank you very much for that interesting and insightful question. First, I want to emphasize that I use the term security isolationism and security multilateralism to emphasize that in economics, the picture was very different. Japan was promoting regional economic multilateralism, such as the Asian Development Bank and other forums, since the 1950s. So Japan was essentially politically and security isolationist, but economically very much engaged in the region. As for the point about economic cooperation as kind of a way for Japan to build confidence with elites in Southeast Asia, I think that's true, but I also think if we go back to the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of dissatisfaction in Southeast Asia with Japan, that it was just interested in raw materials and was not interested in transferring technology, not interested in setting up manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia. Now that by the late 80s and 1990s was changing, but at the time when the Fukuda Doctrine and even the Nakayama proposal, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, and there was also popular dissatisfaction. One kind of antecedent to the Fukuda Doctrine was Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue's visit to Southeast Asia in 1974, when you had the so-called Tanaka riots, when you had a lot of anti-Japan demonstrations in Indonesia and elsewhere in the region, protesting Japan's economic dominance. And it was almost a cliche at that time, and all the way into the 1990s, I saw this repeated, that Japan was achieving the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere without weapons, that they were coming to dominate the region in a very unequal, hierarchical way, like they tried to do during World War II, but they were doing it economically. That perception was out there. And that is what the Fukuda Doctrine and then later the Nakayama proposal tried to address. Now, the Nakayama proposal was more about Japan starting to send its military overseas. I should mention there was a debate about Japan sending the SDF to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf crisis in 1990. There was a lot of opposition in Southeast Asia, also from China and Korea. And this was an attempt to kind of head that off when Japan sent troops to Cambodia. And it was successful. China initially opposed the SDF deployment to Cambodia, but by the end of it, China had come to publicly support it, actually, and has continually supported Japan's participation in UN peacekeeping ever since. They don't necessarily support a lot of other Japanese military overseas deployments, maybe humanitarian relief, but that is one area where Japan's reassurance strategy, even vis-a-vis China, was successful, I would argue. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Pedro. I'm also a fourth year student, and I was wondering, recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen growth in militarization in the South China Sea and in around Taiwan by the Chinese government. And I was wondering, how do you see the future of Japanese security multilateralism in Asia, in East Asia, and not only Japan but ASEAN's role?
Yes, that's a very timely question. Of course, we've seen growing tensions in the South China Sea and over the past decade. Some Chinese artificial island building and militarization. Some artificial island building by Vietnam and some other countries too, but that pales in comparison to what China has been doing. I actually think that I would argue that the ARF and the ADMM+, first of all, are an important place for countries to those disputes to get together and discuss them. They can also be a place where Japan and maybe the US could try to build coalitions to oppose China. US officials in Washington were talking about that. I would add, when I went to Washington to interview about this book and about this topic in 2017, I was expecting that all the elites would say, oh, we don't need regional security multilateralism. All we need is hub and spokes with the US at the center. And I found exactly the opposite. They said hub and spokes is passé. Regional security multilateralism is good for building kind of coalitions of the willing, and they found them very useful in that sense. Also, so one role is regional security multilateralism can play that kind of coalition building function vis-a-vis China, but it can also potentially be a place where there can be meaningful discussions about these disputes. It can also, if that might lead to some kind of resolution. Again, ASEAN and China, first of all, they negotiated a declaration of conduct in the South China Sea in 2002 that arguably did have some beneficial impact for several years. Now, some argue that China has violated that, which is probably true, although China argues some of the other claimants have also violated it. But they're now negotiating a code of conduct. That's taking a long time. That's going to be a more binding agreement, whereas the declaration is non-binding. But even though it's taking a long time, I would not say it's necessarily not going to happen. It's certainly one promising way to manage that conflict. Now, Taiwan is a lot more difficult because China claims that's a domestic dispute, and Taiwan doesn't really participate in these forums. Again, however, regional security multilateralism can be a way to A, put some pressure on China through these meetings, and B, to kind of build coalition and consensus. It might also be a place where other parties could be, talk about the role of other parties. So there's some discussion about whether part of the reason we see more tension with Taiwan is because the US under the Trump administration basically shredded a lot of norms about how you manage the conflict. They started sending high-level officials to Taipei for the first time in decades. And when I looked at it, every time the US sent a high-level official, China responded with military exercises around the islands. So that's another part of the conflict that could potentially be dealt with through these multilateral fora. Also, I'd argue multilateral fora are a good way to talk. First of all, North Korea, the only forum that North Korea shows up to other than the UN is the ARF. And also, even when you have these big tensions, say, between Japan and South Korea and China, and they cancel all their bilateral meetings, so they're not talking to each other, they always show up to at least the ASEAN +3 meeting, and they're in the same room. Why? Because they don't want to tick off ASEAN, because ASEAN is kind of the diplomatic and multilateral heart of the region. So multilateralism kind of insulates bilateral discussions and negotiations from some of these bilateral tensions that often lead to ministerial meetings being canceled in protest.
So I see we do have one question from the virtual audience. I'll ask that question before kind of returning the floor to those who are here. The question is from Kalista Sandi. It's kind of an open-ended and more open-ended question, but how do you see kind of the direction, Japan's direction in its military alliance with ASEAN today, or military relations?
I'm sorry, Japan's...
the direction of Japan's relations, the trajectory of... Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that question. One thing I would emphasize, there is, of course, no alliance between ASEAN and Japan. The ASEAN countries are essentially non-aligned. Now, some of them, like the Philippines and Thailand, have alliances with the US. Others, like Indonesia, are very... I'd also mention that one other thing about ASEAN to keep in mind is this strategy that a scholar in Singapore, Evelyn Goh, calls omni-enmeshment, which is trying to bring in all the great powers. So during in the 1970s, Indonesia promoted something called ZOPFAN, or Zone of Peace and Neutrality, which was the idea they kind of exclude the great powers, the superpowers from the region, and kind of live in this zone of so-called peace and neutrality. But at the end of the Cold War, a leader of ASEAN ISIS that I referred to, Yusuf Wanandi, came up with this idea of let's basically turning that on its head and saying, let's bring in all the great powers and create a balance of interests among them. And that's how we can kind of maintain our regional peace and freedom in Southeast Asia. So, and that is really what the ARF and the ADMM Plus and all these four are. They're trying to bring in and engage all the powers and create a balance of interest and engagement. In terms of Japan, ASEAN security ties, well, there is security dialogue even going on now between ASEAN and Japan. In terms of individual members, we see a deepening of the relationship between the Philippines and Japan in terms of greater security cooperation, more potential weapon sales, mostly still non-combat, non-lethal sales from Japan to the Philippines, deeper cooperation in terms of exercises. One thing, the two sides are now, looks like they're going to conclude an agreement that will allow, that will facilitate the stationing of Philippines troops in Japan and Japanese troops in the Philippines for short-term bilateral exercises. So we're seeing very much a deepening of the relationship with the Philippines. To some extent, we're seeing the same thing with Vietnam, not quite as fast, and maybe also to some extent Indonesia. Those are all countries that, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, that have bilateral disputes with China over the South China Sea. So I think we will see those develop in the future, but I don't really see Japan playing a direct military role in the region. There was a lot of speculation after Japan recognized its right to collective self-defense that you would have Japanese Navy patrolling in the South China Sea and maybe conducting so-called freedom of navigation operations, where they would go into what China claims as the territorial waters around its held Spratly Islands. But Japan hasn't done that. I don't think they will, partly because Japan kind of feels too pressed to maintain and husband its resources around the East China Sea, particularly the Senkaku Islands, to maintain control. But that's essentially where I see it. Japan will continue to build up and support, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, to kind of confront China and the South China Sea. First of all, through non-lethal means such as helping them build their patrolling capabilities, their intelligence and surveillance capabilities, so that they know what China is doing. So if China was to try to sneak up and take something like Mischief Reef again, like it did in 1995 from the Philippines would know and would be there before the Chinese got there. Is essentially what the capabilities that China has been trying to give to Southeast Asian countries. I don't see Japan playing a direct military role.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. And so I see a question from our colleague, Professor Ordaniel.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about the origins of the ARF, because if you talk to contemporary policymakers in Southeast Asia, there is a debate about the real purpose of the ARF. I don't know exactly what Japan's initial thoughts were when it was pushing for the ARF, but the debate is about whether the ARF is a confidence building measure, or the ARF being a three-step process that begins with a CBM, confidence building measure, and once there is confidence, there's trust, we move forward with preventive diplomacy, meaning trying to set up mechanisms that would prevent disputes from escalating or conflicts from expanding. And once the status quo is frozen, so there is that mechanism that prevents the dispute from expanding and so on, we move forward with the last step, which is conflict resolution. So there is a debate in ASEAN, please, about whether ASEAN is just confidence building measure, or is it a three-step process? The Chinese and some Southeast Asian countries are saying that ARF is actually just a confidence building measure. But for some reason, some Japanese interlocutors would tell us that we initially envisioned it to be a three-step process, not stop to the first step, which is confidence building measure. I wonder if that came up in the course of your research, or yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a good question. When the ARF was first established, they established a lot of working groups. They established one on CBMs. They established another on preventive diplomacy, and a couple of others as well. The preventive diplomacy one, to be sure, has not really gone very far, very fast, partly because China's not that enthusiastic about preventive diplomacy. And some ASEAN countries have not necessarily been that supportive either. One thing that I find interesting in terms of the relationship between ASEAN and China is, at least for some ASEAN states, and or maybe most of them more or less, they do share with China a norm of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. And whereas some of the Western members, like Canada, Australia, the US, don't, and so much, and have been much more kind of gung-ho in promoting preventive diplomacy. And Japan is somewhat sided with the US and the other Western countries on that issue. But I also see a debate there. I mean, I've seen some Japanese officials, honestly, I won't say this on the record, Sato Yukio, who have kind of contrast kind of a Western approach to ASEAN and to regional security multilateralism in Southeast Asia versus kind of more of an ASEAN approach and the kind of this ASEAN way of doing things, which is less confrontational and more kind of maybe less, you might say, from the perspective of conflict resolution or preventive diplomacy, kind of less intellectually developed, but more emotionally intelligent in that they, you know, try to, they have consensus building, they try to avoid situations where countries or participants lose face, they try to build confidence through things like conference diplomacy and Gulf outings among foreign ministers and things like that, this kind of soft kind of confidence building. And there's also some debate about whether, you know, this has been successful. I mean, you know, researchers in Scandinavia have discovered an East Asian peace, that East Asia, though there's a lot of, you know, maybe tensions and a lot of rhetoric, has actually been one of the most peaceful regions in the world, much more peaceful than Europe, not even before the Ukraine war. And they talk about an East Asian peace that started in Southeast Asia and then spread to Northeast Asia after 1979. There have been a few disturbances to that, a border war between, a brief border conflict between Cambodia and Thailand, and then the sinking of the Chonon and a bombardment of a coastal town or an island by North Korea. But otherwise, you've had a lot of tensions. You have had, and it's been a remarkably peaceful region. And one question is whether the ASEAN way has actually had some positive impact, contribution to making it such a peaceful region. Now, peace in this case means the absence of conflict where you have 25 or more battle deaths. So you could argue that's a little bit too low a standard and you need a higher standard, but compared to other regions, East Asia looks exceptionally peaceful for some reason from that perspective.
Okay. Oh, sorry. We'll go to Naoki first and then back to. Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So my name is Naoki from the grad school team. So you mentioned HADR, disaster. That reminds me of the operation Tomodachi done by you in the US. So do you have any thoughts on the particular operation that I can in addition to the presentation?
Well, here is a real coincidence. ASEAN, the ARF's second military exercise, its second humanitarian disaster relief exercises, started, it was co-sponsored by Japan and Indonesia. It started on March 11th, 2011, the very day of the earthquake. So once the earthquake became clear, that exercise was canceled. And of course, Japan mobilized the SDF, the largest mobilization in the SDF's history, for disaster relief. And of course, the US played a big role in helping through Operation Tomodachi. It's kind of, HADR has a lot of value in a couple ways. First, it's a way to build confidence and trust among countries. I think Operation Tomodachi did that between the US and Japan. That almost happened between China and Japan after the Sichuan earthquake. China came very close to allowing the SDF to come into China for disaster relief. As it was, you had government personnel coming from China to provide disaster relief from Japan, and that was received very well by the Chinese public and the Chinese state. So it can be a confidence building measure to allow have countries dispatching the militaries to other countries for disaster relief. It can also be useful in terms of kind of demonstrating operational capabilities and the ability of two militaries to cooperate. So Operation Tomodachi it's been seen as the first actual military-to-military operation between the US and Japan, whereas up to now what you've had is only really joint exercises, but no actual joint operation. So it demonstrated the ability of the two militaries to cooperate. It also demonstrated their capabilities. An official from Japan's defense ministry made the point that the mobilization of over 100,000 SDF military personnel in less than a week, including some reservists, sent a clear message to China about Japan's capabilities to mobilize quickly. So it can have that role too. And also just, again, back to kind of joint operations, just the ability of the militaries to communicate with each other and know how each other's standard operating procedures work, etc. And that's also the value of some of these exercises through the ARF and the ADMM+. They're also a way for militaries to get to know each other on a personal level, maybe build contacts that might come in useful if there's a crisis sometime in the future. So those are some of the ways in which HADR exercises and actual operations can contribute to broader security.
And I think, Kwon, you had another question.
So back to your action to his question regarding the future of Japan and Southeast Asia security cooperation. So you mentioned the surveillance and reconnaissance capability building from Japan to Southeast Asia, especially in the Philippines now, potentially Vietnam more and more in the future. So do you see that Japan is as, if not the most crucial actors in this, even more than the US? Because we now know that in South China Sea, Southeast Asia, China and US on each spectrum, and those Southeast Asian countries, they don't want to buy a lot of things from the US or buy a lot of things from China, either from any of them. So they head to Japan. And for example, Japan transferred a lot of, if I remember correctly, the TC-90s, which is a maritime patrol reconnaissance aircraft, to the Philippines. And I see that as one of the backdrop for Japan to promote a lot of ISR capability building in Southeast Asia. I think that would be the key, like the choke point or the key point for Japan to head for. I think that what Southeast Asian country may head for, as for Japan as a partner in security cooperation and as ISR capability provider, even more than the US to some extent. Just my opinion.
Well, first of all, thank you for reminding me of that acronym, which I kind of had in the back of my head but hadn't remembered. ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Yes, that is exactly as you said, what Japan is trying to build up for the Philippines and to some extent also Vietnam and Indonesia by, for example, transferring Coast Guard vessels, Coast Guard cutters, either new or used to those countries, and also helping them with communications equipment with the surveillance, maritime surveillance aircraft being transferred from the SDF that you mentioned. Actually, in the SDF, they were trainer aircraft, but they were repurposed for surveillance in the case of the Philippines. So that is a real value, but it's not at the level of what the US is doing in the region in terms of being a potential military counterweight to China. The ISR capabilities that Japan is helping these countries acquire means that they know, gives them a good insight into what China is doing so they can anticipate and maybe get there first. So that makes it harder for China to, say, unilaterally change the status quo without using force. So the point is, like Mischief Reef, 1995, China kind of snuck up and took this reef from the Philippines when they weren't looking or they weren't paying attention. So the idea is to stop that from happening so that if they do show up at some spratly geographical feature and want to take it from the Philippines or Vietnam, you know, the Philippines or Vietnam would be there already. So they would basically have to choose between backing down or engaging in some kind of conflict that then could escalate. But if you get to the point of like a major military conflict, Coast Guard vessels and ISR have limited utility. At that point, you need more robust military systems, some of which the US has provided. The US provided, for example, old destroyers to the Philippines as one major example. Or more direct involvement by the US militarily to oppose what China is doing. That said, it's also clear that given the kind of changing balance of power, if there were actual a full-blown military conflict, the US couldn't really operate anymore in the South China Sea except for submarines, just because surface ships would be too vulnerable there. But for lower levels of conflict, yeah, the U.S. would certainly, its surface vessels, conventional naval power would be really important. And that's something Japan is not in a position to replace and is not really intending to replace it, as I see it.
Yes, yes. So thank you for your answer. Of course, I totally agree with you. So if things escalate, then Japan would not can really effectively play any role. But to the point that there's low level of escalation. So what I focus on is ISR. And do you believe that Japan is the future in the short term? Because I mentioned that there's China and US here in both sides. Neither of Southeast Asian countries want to purchase a lot of things from these two to offend the other. So perhaps, for example, Japan, India, Russia. In India, maybe Japan is one of the providers for ISR capability. For them to prevent China from swooping in like a day, like the past.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, in terms of ISR provision, Japan has a key role to play. Maybe some other countries too, maybe some of the other middle powers like Australia and Canada, maybe India too. Also, though, it's important to point out, interestingly, and this is still true even now, even despite the war, that, for example, Vietnam, their main arms supplier is Russia. And that doesn't seem like it's about to change, even despite the war in Ukraine. But yeah, so I think you're right that Southeast Asian countries may want to acquire weapons from countries other than the US or China, and they also want to stay a bit neutral. In fact, interestingly, Southeast Asian countries, except for Singapore, have been relatively neutral in terms of the current conflict over Ukraine. And I think that reflects, again, the kind of non-aligned position in the world that they also share to some extent with India, for example.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for attending today. And I think if we've answered all the questions virtually as well. I'd like to thank Professor Can I? We still have time for one more question. Yes, Professor Miyashita.
Please, thank you so much.
Yes.
Paul, thank you once again for coming to TIU. Professor Midford and I studied together over 30 years ago at Columbia University. We were all both graduate students, and it's really nice to reunite. Yeah. And so I'm really happy to see you again. And thank you for your presentation. Congratulations for your third. Is this going to be your third book?
As a monograph, it's my second.
Oh, I see. Well, that's great. I have learned a lot from your presentation today. I have three specific questions which came up with my mind. First, the term isolationism. I understand what you meant by Japan's security isolationism. But at the same time, isolationism, the term has implications that Japan's shying away from doing anything military. In terms of bilateral US-Japan security alliance, I think Japan has been quite active. And if I remember correctly, Japan announced the Prime Minister Kishi in 1950s, late 50s, Prime Minister Sato in 1960s. They both announced that this bilateral alliance is important to prevent war or to maintain peace at the Korean Peninsula and also at the Taiwan Strait. So I think indirectly, Japan has been involving in the regional security policy. But once again, I fully understand that what you meant by the Japan security isolationism is that Japan is not willing, Japan was not willing to play a role in the multilateral setting. So that's good. The second question is Japan's isolationism in terms of a multilateral security setting unique in East Asia? If I look at countries like South Korea or China, or maybe Australia, I'm not really sure. During the Cold War, East Asian countries have been active in promoting multilateralism in security arrangement. So if Japan is not unique in that sense, maybe the question is why you want to study this subject. What's so different about Japan compared to other countries? So that's the second comment/question. And the third one is the reasons for isolationism. You mentioned that at the end of the Cold War and perhaps the lessons of the Gulf War. You mentioned those two as the two important reasons why Japan shifted from security isolationism to more multilateral reasons. But if that is the case, I think Japan can still pursue bilateralism with the US. Why multilateralism? I don't see quite strong reasons. You mentioned about the security reassurance. That may be a good reason why Japan began to pursue multilateralism like ASEAN. But if that's the case, then Japan should have pursued multilateralism during the Cold War. Why didn't? My basic question here is why Japan shifted from only pursuing a bilateral security ties with the US and shifting towards multilateralism, although the US-Japan security ties remains the basic and most important security policy for Japan. Maybe in addition to reassurance, another factor like the rise of China, and which you already mentioned, the rise of China may have been a very strong reason behind Japan pursuing, in this particular case, the Quad, for example, the US, Japan, Australia, India security, tie. So those are the three sort of comments/questions that I have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for those questions. Aki, it was certainly wonderful. I was invited here. Wonderful to see you too. It's embarrassing to think it's been over 30 years since graduate school, but regarding your questions, those excellent questions. Yeah, by isolationism, I agree that Japan definitely, the bilateral alliance definitely contributed to regional security, but as you said, it was indirect contribution. And most importantly, it was a contribution that involved Japan essentially avoiding any direct security ties with other countries. So like for today, we have this Australian-Japan security cooperation, security partnership. They just concluded an agreement that allowed Japanese troops to go to Australia and Australian forces to come to Japan for exercises. In recent years, you've had British armed forces coming to Japan for exercises. You've had Indian forces. You've had all kinds of military exercises with countries other than the US. And during the Cold War, we had none of that. I mean, if you just look at countries Japan has any kind of security cooperation with, even dialogues or defense minister visits, there was remarkably little of that during the Cold War. I actually published a separate edited book on this whole question, essentially about Japan's security isolationism, or how it sort of decentered a bit from the US-Japan alliance over the since 2000. So I think that's part of the story. It's not just opposition to regional security multilateralism, that's part of it. It's even opposition to bilateral cooperation with anybody except the US. And again, I think the RIMPAC exercise is just an example of how extreme that could become. Another reason, is Japan unique in terms of avoiding regional security multilateralism? Well, during the Cold War, I'm almost tempted to say, could we go back to 2 slides back? I don't know if you can see this, it's pointing the wrong direction, but there are some examples of regional security multilateralism. There was SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Of course, that's more Southeast Asia. But the US would have been happy if Japan had joined that. Then there's this thing called ASPAC, which is what Asia, well, I don't even remember what it's called now, but Asia, basically Asia Pacific. It's a multilateral security forum established by South Korea in 1966. That Japan joined very reluctantly and quickly pulled out of, particularly when it normalized relations with China, and it eventually collapsed. But that was South Korea was definitely promoting regional security cooperation, seeing it as kind of a supplement to the U.S.-Japan alliance, maybe even, and to build security cooperation. So South Korea was certainly interested. Now, Australia, New Zealand, where you have at least trilateralism through ANZUS, of course. Now, when you get around the time of the Nakayama proposal, you have a lot of countries getting out ahead of Japan. You have Australia and Canada proposing a regional multilateral security forum. South Korea proposes one. I think Mongolia proposed one. Actually, when I was a graduate student, I working at a think tank in New York, produced a paper about this. And Japan was listed as one of the opponents along with the US. This was just before the Nakayama proposal. But you had these whole series of proposals coming out. And another reason for the Nakayama proposal that one could speculate on, and that I actually saw in government foreign ministry documents I was able to get declassified or released, was that by 1990, the expectation was growing that there was going to be some kind of regional multilateral forum established. And the only question was by whom and what would it look like? And another reason for the Nakayama proposal was an attempt to get out ahead of that and to shape what kind of forum it would actually be. In terms of countries who are skeptical about regional security multilateralism, Japan was skeptical in 1991. The other country that's really skeptical, you actually didn't mention, is China. China was very skeptical and tended to see all security multilateralism, including the UN, as maybe some way to kind of contain China or constrain it. But over time, China kind of socialized about the late 1990s. China really came to embrace the ARF and started making proposals for institutionalizing it, and essentially came to see multilateralism, security multilateralism, as something that would be used to contain China, and began to see it as the reverse, as something China could use to constrain the United States, Japan, and others and promote its own interests. So I actually think China would be the clearest comparison in terms of a country that, like Japan, was skeptical about regional security multilateralism. Well, North Korea too, perhaps. Now, the final question, so what's the relationship between regional security multilateralism and bilateralism? Well, I've tried to suggest that for Japan, there was never a substitute, that they play different roles. So regional security multilateralism is a way to reassure originally semi-friendly countries, and particularly ASEAN countries, or friendly countries, not aligned countries, but friendly countries in Southeast Asia, that Japan could send its military to Cambodia to participate in UN peacekeeping operations, send it elsewhere without provoking opposition from them. And it's not as obvious that they wouldn't be opposed as you might think. Again, there was some opposition to earlier attempts to deploy the SDF during the Gulf crisis. Then senior statesman Lee Kuan Yew came to Tokyo in 1992 as part of a kind of study group formed by Prime Minister Miyazawa. I got the documents, Freedom of Information, I got those documents released. And in that speech, he says to a private audience, he's fine with Japan participating in UN peacekeeping operations as long as it's non-combat, as long as it doesn't involve anything related to use of force. So even for someone like him, that you might think would have a more benign view of Japan's sending the military overseas for peacekeeping, he was still, even in private, rather cautious about the idea. So I think it did was important for that. In terms of why there was no reassurance, Japan did not support regional security multilateralism during the Cold War. Again, I think it was essentially the idea that if Japan didn't play a role if the less seen of the SDF, the better. If Japan kept a very low profile and just concentrated on territorial defense, that was the best way to kind of reassure East Asian countries Japan would not become a threat. Some scholars have also written about, Yoshida originally kind of having this isolationist vision of Japan politically and security, and in terms of security, which is why he opposed a U.S. proposal in the early 1950s for a Pacific Pact that would be a bit like NATO and would integrate Japan maybe with other regional militaries in an alliance. The rise of China as a factor. Well, at the time of the Nakayama proposal, China was definitely not a factor. Of course, it was soon after Tiananmen. China looked weak. I know, again, from interviewing diplomats and looking at documents from the foreign ministry, the real issue was the Soviet Union. And it was thought that we couldn't, if we let in one socialist country like China, it would be hard for Japan not to agree to letting in the Soviet Union. And the policy priority at that point was keeping the Soviet Union out was more important than putting China in. So that means at that point, China was a secondary factor. And Soviet policy trumped policy towards China. Now, over time, of course, that changed. China obviously rose, it became more important. But Japan's activism really predates that. Now, you mentioned the Quad. I was expecting a lot of questions about the Quad, so I'm glad you asked that. The Quad is more like what I would call mini-lateralism, which is involvement of essentially semi-aligned states in terms of kind of more narrow cooperation, security cooperation in this case. Interestingly, the Quad actually grew out of the ARF. And in fact, India has and may still even want to kind of keep it tied to the ARF, partly because they want to maintain a good relationship with ASEAN, partly because they're actually a bit ambivalent about how deep this cooperation goes. And if we look at, for example, the current conflict in Ukraine, we see that India is much more non-aligned than is often thought. And I might just leave with that kind of thought, which is whether it's India or Southeast Asia. One thing I found writing this book is how often, in particular, Japan and to some extent the US, projects their ideas about what ASEAN is or what India is or what they want it to be onto those states. So before the Nakayama proposal, Japanese diplomats in private were saying, well, ASEAN, we share the same political system, we share the same ideology. So, they're almost like an extension of the US-Japan alliance somehow. But that's not the way ASEAN looks at itself, particularly a non-aligned state like Indonesia. And I think that's sort of true for India too. They don't necessarily see themselves as an extension of, say, the US-Japan alliance or really necessarily want to be linked. They do have concrete interests they share in common with the US and Japan regarding China, but they're not necessarily, that doesn't mean they necessarily want to align too closely. And I also think that's important, again, for understanding kind of this role of ASEAN as trying to keep itself as a kind of diplomatic, security, political center and hub in Southeast Asia. It's based on, again, what Evelyn Goh calls omni-enmeshment, which I argue was something that Jusuf Wanandi developed, an intellectual in Indonesia around the time of the Nakayama proposal. In fact, was even talking about these issues with Sato Yukio in the month before that proposal. But it's that kind of idea of bringing in all the powers and trying to balance them out, which is what I think their ultimate strategy is. I don't know if that answers your final part of your question or not. It did. Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. And on that,
thank you for having me.
No, it was absolutely our pleasure, and it's alarming how fast time flies after grad school, I guess. So on that note, and also on the note of we'll certainly be hearing a lot more, I'm sure, about kind of what non-alignment means in the context of countries like India in the coming weeks and months. And we'll be having another panel actually on April 27th here in the Sakura Room, where we have invited guests, including Professor James Brown from Temple University and Professor Hatakayama Kyoko from Niigata Prefectural University. And of course, our very own colleagues. It'll be moderated by Professor Miyashita and myself and Professor Mema and Professor Honig will also be joining in a couple weeks' time. in this exact same place. But thank you so much, Professor Midford, for the presentation. Also, everybody, check out his book, Overcoming Isolationism, Japan's Leadership in East Asian Security. Make sure we have that in the library for you to check out and learn more about the arguments that Professor Midford presented here today. Thank you once again.
Thank you.